Um, Good morning. My name is Vasyl Myroshnychenko. I run a strategic communications firm in Ukraine. I work with big multinationals, helping them navigate the mighty waters of Ukraine, but also helping Ukrainian companies communicate internationally, raise finance, and do business internationally. We have a diverse panel today, what I suggest as our agenda, I will actually introduce each speaker one by one, and I will ask them to do their opening remarks for 5 minutes, which would be focused on their field of their expertise. Of course, we're talking about agriculture, but there are so many different themes and topics that we can address in this panel. And then I will ask questions, and we'll just go on from there. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I will give you an opportunity to ask it once we're done with our opening remarks. So I suggest we start with John Shmorhun. He is the CEO of Generation, which is a big agriculture company. In the past, he used to run the office of DuPont in the region here, and he was the CEO of business in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and the whole CIS. And for the past 8 years, he's been in actually traditional, conventional agriculture business in Ukraine, running a huge company in eastern part of Ukraine. And John, when we talk about Ukraine, we always talk about agriculture. We always talk about, grain and brain. By grain we mean agriculture, by brain we mean IT. But apparently the global population is growing. So people need food to eat, and Ukraine is there to provide that food. So what opportunities you see for international investors? How is business going on for you? What challenges you face? And where we are, what's your assessment of the general environment in Ukraine for international investors looking at the agricultural sector?
Hello? Hello? Okay. Thank you very much, Vasyl. Well, I've been in agriculture most of my adult life. I was brought up on a farm in Maryland. I worked in agriculture with DuPont for 20 years, and was in this startup of Generation with Sigma Blazer back in 2009. Why did I come into this sector, and particularly why in Ukraine? First of all, as you mentioned, yes, the population is growing. The world, maybe today, doesn't struggle so much to keep up with growth, and in terms of the supply of grains and oil seeds to feed the world. But unfortunately, anytime you see lines like this, you need to get scared, because populations grow, but the land resources is limited. As a matter of fact, the agricultural land that's available today is limited and even decreasing. Why is it decreasing? For a number of reasons. One is urbanization. People are moving from villages to cities. There are less people to work on the lands. The other reason is pure erosion, degradation of the lands. I'm not sure it will be mentioned today, but there is a FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization project today in which we are involved that deals with limiting erosion, protection of moisture, and protection of the tree lines around fields so that less erosion occurs. Other reasons, well, we have this concept called the GMO effect. As you know, GMO was brought in by a number of companies many years ago that has actually improved the yields of crops, improved the traits of crops. Well, even that, this GMO effect, is limited. on what it can do in terms of improving yields. By the way, Ukraine is not a GMO country. GMOs are illegal in Ukraine. But for those countries that grow, the effect of GMO is limited. So when you combine erosion, people moving to cities, the limitation on the amount of yield that you can have. I mean, it used to be very aggressive, now it's limited. But growing populations, the food supply eventually will be limited. Ukraine as a country is the only country in the world that is actually growing in agriculture. The availability of agricultural land is actually, even though it's there, the operation of that land is growing, because out of 32 million hectares, only 27 million hectares are being operated today. So, and on top of that, Ukraine's exports are growing year upon year. So, who can feed the world? United States is number one, but the US population is growing. European Union, perhaps number two. But again, European Union's population is growing. Its land is limited. Who's number three? Ukraine. Ukraine is, well, either two or three. In the world, is the only country that can continue to grow and increase its exports to the world. That's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I would like to present to you Jean-Jacques Herve, who is the Vice President of the Ukrainian-French Chamber of Commerce. He has had diverse experience initially in the academic field, then as a civil servant, French civil servant, and then he came to Ukraine 20 years ago as an advisor to the Ukrainian government about the reform of the agricultural sector, and later on he worked for Crédit Agricole in Ukraine. So, Jean-Jacques, I'm very much interested in your, you've been here for such a long time. What are your observations? Are we moving in the right direction? And what we need, what is missing? I mean, after so many years, I'm sure that your opinion about developments here has been evolving. What's your impressions now? Where are we now in this respect?
Well, I fully first agree with what John said about the potential that is available in Ukraine. Probably Ukraine is not exactly only the one country who is able to feed the world. Probably the large neighbor has also discovered after the sanctions from the Western countries that he also has a very large potential, and probably we should think of the competition from the Black Sea market that will arise between Russia and Ukraine, because they are both able to export at the moment roughly 40 million tons a year, and probably there is a potential of increasing the land share of agriculture in Russia as well. Well, just a small correction. I think we should take that into account. My observations would be for Ukraine that it's difficult to know whether Ukraine really need a frame law for developing agriculture. But I would say yes, the country needs something to know what would be the structures in the future. I'm sure that there is a large, and Gary will speak of that, a large potential for the development of middle-sized farms. And I'm sure that we need to support the cooperatives, because I don't see any country in the world who has really succeeded without the cooperative. Even the United States have large cooperatives, and these large cooperatives have been really very important to support agriculture. I think we should think of that in Ukraine, probably in the frame of what already happened during the last 20 years in Ukraine. We will not do probably the same cooperatives that we have in the Western countries. Notably, we can observe that none of the cooperative banks that are working in Ukraine, Raiffeisen, Crédit Agricole, have started a cooperative bank in Ukraine. So probably there are good reasons for that. We may probably think of Kozactvo or Fratsbratstvo. I don't know what the words that we should use, but probably the word cooperative and the kolkhozs had bad remembrances for the most of the farmers in Ukraine. But we should think of that. Probably also something which would connect the largest companies with a structure of middle-sized farms. Second thing that we could think of as a remark is that there is no country in the world that has developed really its agriculture and support its leading position without a huge effort in training, education and research. And these three fields of investment, public and private investments, are really lacking at the moment in Ukraine. We have a real lack. There are too much still agrarian universities, but so few real programs for managing the training of those who are working in the fields, in the farms, in the management, in the risk management, and so on. We need that. And we need research. We need research everywhere, because we are facing a real green revolution with the genetics. I remember when I was taught as an engineer in agronomy many years ago, unfortunately, there was many things that now exist that were not existing at the time. In genetics, for instance, in biology, in knowledge of the symbiotic life in the soils. And we have to include that. And probably in Ukraine, facing a very, very large potential of development. Even because we have that huge potential, good climate, water resources, fantastic soils, we have to take care of that. And Ukraine should probably be a leading country also in this field of research. I'm sure that we cannot just bet on the fact that the Dnieper is an enormous amount of water available. We should think today, of some news. I have been myself stuck a few days ago when I learned that by the beginning of May, we have used all the resources that we are allowed to use on our planet in the perspective, in the frame of a sustainable development. And it means that we have to be very, very careful with all the resources, and notably iron, India, China are missing water. We should think of making water. We should work on the balance, and if we discuss of investment and banking, for instance, is it more interesting to bet on irrigation that costs a lot to increase the yields, or to bet on improving water management without irrigation? That's the sort of questions that research should discuss. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jean-Jacques. Now I'd like to present Dr. Gary Reusche. Am I correct? Oh, you say Reusche. It's fine. So Gary has been in this region also for a while. He's worked on privatization in Russia and then later on in Ukraine. Mostly he was involved in actually encouraging small and medium enterprises in the rural areas, and we understand that this is a must, and all of you mentioned that, because we now see actually then advent of large agricultural corporations. In a way, they are there intimidating all those small farmers are taking over. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm more interested in hearing about your impressions and about your insights. How can we encourage people in the rural areas, for instance, to start their own businesses? Do they need money? Do they need empowerment? What do they need to do that? And you've been doing it for a big part of your life, but the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I have been working on these issues for some time, and in fact, I live on an ex-collective farm. My wife grew up on it. These rural lifestyles and small and medium farms is something that I've been working for, and not only working for, I live that kind of a life today. But let's talk a little bit about what happened, when the kolkhozes and the collective farms were, of course, privatized. We all know that the privatization didn't continue to its logical conclusion because we have a moratorium that's been going on for many years. How has this impacted? How has the privatization impacted on the ability of small and medium enterprises to develop in the rural areas? My answer to that is significantly. If we just talk about I've worked with the banking sector in Ukraine, with the insurance sector in Ukraine. I'm also an extension specialist, the education part. And so when we want to talk about small and medium enterprises, well, let's start initially and say, who has ever really helped people in rural areas? The kinds of training that's needed to develop their businesses, to consolidate their lands, to be able to gain access to finance, and to grow their businesses. Who has helped them, really, in the last 20 years in this country? I've been here for about 20 years, like most of the others in the room. Not much help has been there. A lot of words have been given. We want to help them, we want to provide it. Extension services, the Americans and others have tried to put them together. Have they been successful? No. Why? Well, we can talk about it. But let's just say that it is a major thing. Don't get me wrong. When we look at the Ukraine's economy today, the holdings are really what are keeping this country alive. We have to be grateful to them. They are working. They have absolutely transformed the agricultural sector. What we laughed at 20 years ago when we saw the old Soviet-era tractors, we now see these, go to exhibitions and we see rooms full of tractors as big as this hall, and we say, my God, what a miracle has taken place in this country in the last few years. And so we can't say this miracle with the holdings and the large enterprise has been something that's to the detriment of Ukraine. However, I would suggest that that this phenomenon of the holdings were not at the end of the game. A lot of these holdings had developed under corrupt times. They had advantages, political and social and others, that allowed them to produce. The land that they are using is land that they have rented from owners like my wife, who has received these lands after collectivization was disbanded. And so these advantages have been good for the holdings and good for the Ukraine in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. But what about the future? I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, very good points. By the way, it actually, just keep the mic because I'm going to ask you a question and then I'll ask all the speakers to respond to it. All of you mentioned the land reform in Ukraine. And as we know, there are economic arguments in favor and there are political arguments in favor, but there are, again, those who are against it, and we see that the political government's arguments which go against the land reform are much stronger these days. But in your opinion, do you think we'll be able to implement the land reform after the next presidential elections or not?
Okay, you're asking about a crystal ball, and so how do we answer that one? But really, I mean, we've been promising that the land reform would come for many years, haven't we? And all I can say is, if we talk about the academics, we talk about the international institutions like the one I worked for, the World Bank Group, International Finance Corporation, the European Union, the investment banks, I don't care who it is, whatever academic you want to talk to, they're all say that this moratorium is not good for Ukraine and not good for the development. And by the way, I'll add that it's very good for the large holdings. Yeah? And so will it happen or will it not? I think it has to happen. There's no question. It must happen. What are we going to retain the Soviet system into the 22nd century? I don't think so.
And Jean-Jacques?
Well, myself, I think that there is no ground to discuss whether land should be or not privatized. It has already been decided in '91. So the question is how. My observation would be, first, that there are redders at the moment who makes a terrible pressure over all the guys who are involved in agriculture, seriously. That's so big pressure, corrupted pressure, that the Minister of Justice himself provides a service to the tenants of the farms that are advised of an attack on the number of registration of their land lease. So what to do? I observe also that the law that has been promoted by Mr. Pavlenko when he was working as Minister of Agriculture in Ukraine is not applied because the law has been in force already 5 years ago. It proposed that no land lease could be shorter than 7 years, and we still have most of the land lease at 2 or 1 year. So that means there's something that is not working in the system. Third thing, I would consider very simply, that in European countries, for instance, where the experience of privatized land is long enough, in France, half of the land worked by the farmer is rented. All land is property, private property, but half of the farming land is rented and half is in property. And I observe also that the best results of average French farms are obtained in the regions where most of the land is rented and not owned. And I observe that having possibilities to propose to young people to start farming is better when it's possible to rent the land at a reasonable price than where we have to support the huge capitalization to start on a private land. Finally, I would observe also in Ukraine that we're in a very paradoxical situation. The cadastre, which is a monster in Ukraine for me, as a specialist of these questions in the past years, is registering the pie, which are virtual land, but is not registering the plots of land that we see, which are the real object of managing crop production. And so we are now in a situation where many people are discussing whether we should sell or not the land, when I would advise the people not to do anything, because I would myself never buy a pie, because I don't know where it is, whatever, even if there was any register saying this is there, but this is not real fact. And I can buy only a plot of land, or a right to use a plot of land. So my view is that the first law is not to discuss land property or not, land sale or not, but a real registration of the plots of land that they are, with the rule, with the list of the pie that are inside, and a law saying how to use that plot, renting it or selling it. I suggest myself that a large majority from the people who have right on one plot of land would be required to make a decision. So for instance, that if 3/4 of the pie owner would say, okay, we are ready not to use our pie, and we are ready to rent that, to give that land renting to someone, we will rent it. Or they would say, we are ready to sell. So that it will be the law. It will be compulsory, not for only 3/4, but for 100% of the pie itself. And I'm sure that such a simple law, which do not require to change everything in the constitution, in the law, in the blah, would give a better and more comfortable situation. Peace in the countryside. We need peace in the countryside, so the people are sure to be able to work on their land for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Agriculture is a long-term business. A man in his life can be responsible for 40, 50 harvests only.
Yeah, again. John?
I couldn't agree more with Jean-Jacques. This is probably the most civilized, legally based approach we could ask for. Unfortunately, we live in this reality. The reality is called Ukraine. The lifting of the moratorium is inevitable. It's going to happen. My predictions are that it will be done chaotically, that we are going to probably live through several years of chaotic movement, of land grabbing, the money that's laying under pillows here in Ukraine that has not been able to go out of Ukraine will be used. It will unfortunately be a mechanism, could very well be a mechanism for some serious money laundering, which unless the government finds a way to control, it's just going to happen. In my business is farming. The purchase of agricultural land is a different business. I call that real estate business, okay? I personally am not interested in buying land, okay? For two reasons. One, I don't believe these prices that we're hearing today of what that land could cost are really true, because I don't believe there's enough liquidity in the market to buy this land. If you just take the land that is being operated by agricultural companies today, that's somewhere around 5 to 7 million hectares. That's $7 billion. Okay, that's at $1,000 per hectare. Okay, that's $7 billion. Where's that money going to come from? There is no money like that. So this land moratorium, the lifting, it will take several years for it to stabilize. Companies like mine are going to wait for that to stabilize, and then we will take decisions. Whoever ends up buying that land, well, will probably end up renting from them. Okay? But I do believe that the land owners today, the pie holders today, will be taking some critical decisions, because as we know, land rent is increasing year upon year. And they'll be taking some critical decisions. Let's see, am I going to continue taking $100, $150, $200 per hectare per year equivalent? Or am I just going to sell today for $1,000, okay? So I think there will be a natural decision process anyway, even after the lifting of the moratorium, where pie holders will say, am I going to lease or am I going to sell? So it is, unfortunately, I can't give you a direct answer. It's going to happen. It's not going to happen until after the elections, okay? So next year, maybe in 2 or 3 years. It will be very chaotic at first. Land prices expectations are going to be very high. And as people realize liquidity is not there, prices are going to start coming down. And then people will be taking decisions to buy, to rent, to sell, to rent.
Just keep the mic, John. I want to ask you another question. We'll go for the entire panel again. In the previous panel, which was here, there was a discussion how Ukraine can attract more investment, and there was a discussion about nation branding, a good communications campaign, and then there was another point of view that it's all about success stories and actually what Ukraine does, which communicates much better than any communication campaign. But my question is very specific on agriculture. Ukraine has managed to attract a fair amount of investment into food processing and agriculture, but we need more. So what do you think we could do, Ukraine as a country, to attract more foreign direct investment into food processing and agro? What's your recommendation? What do you think is gonna be that boost?
Success stories are very important. Unfortunately, Ukraine, the news of investors in the past has not been good news. You have the history of Maria, but you have other problems, okay? As companies begin cleaning up, because, you know, this is Ukraine, but we are all in a global system today. All of the legacies of 2008 and all the financial crises and the bank crises have led to one moment, okay? Know your customer. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for, I think, Ukrainian companies to be able to get loans or to be able to create companies, Cyprus companies, to internationalize their operations until they become more transparent. So obviously, you know, the more transparent companies are, I consider my company transparent. We're traded on the Paris Stock Exchange. We're a publicly traded company. More transparent companies are, the more they have good stories to tell, the more attracted investors are going. Unfortunately, Ukraine suffers from this legacy of investors getting, screwed. And those memories are slowly going away, but we need more success. And investors are coming. Honestly, I see more movement today than I saw last year, or certainly the year before. I see more movement today. I see more interest coming even from Europe, which is a major thing, not just from China or the Far East. So it's happening, okay? Now, just one thing about food processing, because this seems to be the big question. The commodity business in Ukraine is actually quite a profitable business. It's not, prices are going up. We feel a lot more confident today. I'm in the commodity business. When you look at processing, it's not so obvious, okay? Sunflower, yes. I mean, we have plenty of capacity, probably overcapacity. So there's certain advantages for sunflower producers today because you have a choice to sell. But in some of the other food processing businesses, it's not so obvious to me, okay? If you look at the processing of, let's say, legumes or corn or wheat, it really requires a very serious analysis. Are the margins really there? Are the margins there? So why isn't, we see sunflower, this is an obvious thing, but why don't we see more food processing in Ukraine? Ukraine is becoming one of the larger producers of corn and soy, non-GMO, and all of this stuff. Why don't we see it? Well, first of all, it's big investment. Wet processing of corn is $100 million plus, okay? It's a big investment. And then the question is, what are the markets? So for me, the processing question is a go-to-market strategy, okay? Only. If there is a market for processed corn ingredients, I think eventually somebody's going to build a wet processing facility in Ukraine. But just to say Ukraine needs to be processing more, it's not so obvious to me. Not so obvious. I'm not sure the margins are there.
I do agree with that, because if you consider processing and food processing especially, you need to know whom you will sell this food processing. Food processing and food products. And the experience in the world is that you can buy the products that the clients and customers are eager to buy. So I can hope to sell my cheeses, French food, Italian meat and so on, and wines. I don't see what I can really export from Ukraine. I may export food, I may export flour, okay, but the margin, as said John, is so small that the French industrials that are producing flour say to me recently, if we had not already financed the mills, we would not invest a kopeck in them. So I think probably Russia has an interest to invest, as they do today, in food processing, because they will finance their industry by the economy that they are doing on importing the food. But this is not the situation in Ukraine. So Ukraine could probably make something in the field of processing, but something else than usually food. And in my view, the priority would not be those in investment. I would invest in wagons, but we need to change. The lack of wagon is probably something as 10,000 wagons. But we need to be sure to have the right to use the wagons in which you would invest your money, which at the moment is still not the case. And a wagon company is really a very large source of profit in the States, in France, Germany, in all countries where we have grain and heavy things to transport. So 10,000 wagons is a large market and would support a development of industry. We need barges because most of the grain is going at the moment from trucks, which cost 10 times more than a ton transported by a barge. And we may have fluvio-maritimes, as we say in French, barges that allow to go to Morocco, to Algeria from Cherkasy, without any additional cost. These need to have good conditions to have these barges. And it costs a lot also. It is a good object of investment. And so I think we should take the fields in which there is a real interest in investing, and we should make an identification of the fakticzne problems, of the real problems that we have to solve. Why? Why the companies that are ready to invest, who have understood that wagons are lacking, that barges should be developed, why do they not have made investment programs? We should stop to make these very general views and yes, we should involve money, blah, 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 blah. This is just, stupid. Make a simple calculation to add some figures. John said putting money in land is at least $7 billion. $7 billion. This is the deficit of the commercial balance of Ukraine.
How can we bring more French investors into the agro sector?
Sorry?
How can we bring more French investors into the agro sector?
Well, I tried to do that as a vice president of the Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. And last year we had the first seminar for investment, promoting investment among French companies. I know most of the French companies, cooperative, private companies. I talk with more than 100 CEOs of these companies. And out of these 100 people, I got 3 participants in the seminar. Why? Because they are absolutely convinced of the very huge potential, but they are afraid of the lack of legacy, of fairness in the business, of rule of law, which would protect them. Not only because they want to have a contract saying you are covered by an insurance, but because you need to be in a climate of confidence. A climate of confidence is not only the paper, this is the soul. This was my experience when I began the business in farming, financing, the Crédit Agricole, who was not a bank involved in agriculture. And I suddenly understood, on the experience of my work as an advisor to the government, that the main problem was the lack of confidence. So I tried to create the conditions of confidence, and especially with the bank, because banks are, unfortunately in Ukraine, probably after the judges and the police, there's the third institutions in which nobody has truth. Yeah. Okay? And changing the conditions of confidence makes the bank develop and beneficial. So I think that is not only a matter of additional law and rules and decree and all sorts of official documents. This is a matter of soul.
Yeah. Good point. Gary?
Well, I think I'm going to just continue along the same lines. I think we're absolutely agreed that really what we're talking about, if we want to see investments come into Ukraine in the agricultural sector, we're really talking about the business climate and anything and everything that has to do with the business climate. But I think most of us would agree with what we read in the newspapers on a regular basis, that one of the biggest problems is the lack of the judiciary, the lack of the rule of law. We don't see investments coming into Ukraine today, even though there's a huge amount of interest. Why not? I think we're talking about it now because of the lack of trust and the lack of, let's say, the continuity. So it's really important, but this isn't new, is it? We've all been talking about this for many years, actually, not just today. And so the question is, okay, do we just sit back as a society and say, well, okay, the Verkhovna Rada is going to fix it? Or do we say that's not going to happen? Some other solution has to be brought to make this equation change. And I think we've seen this happening in the last 3 or 4 years in Ukraine. We've seen different types of activism, people who are saying that this system that we've had in the past has to change, we have to move away from it, and only that is going to bring investments. And this can be talked about, I mean, in various different ways. We talked about the banking. One of the previous speakers did say that this is one of the bright spots, of course, of the reforms in the last few years, and I agree with that. But the thing is that the banking system is absolutely influenced by the business environment in which the country exists in. I mean, for example, why do we have high interest rates? How much does the lack of a judiciary, proper judiciary, how much is the lack of proper contract laws to be able to enforce them, how much of those actually produce these high interest rates? It's a significant amount. When we add that to the inflation that's going on because of the various problems, then all of a sudden we understand why the interest rates are so high, which makes it so much more difficult, of course, for the farms to be able to do business and to acquire, or even want to acquire those loans. So I think really in terms of investments, it's trust. It's trust, it's the business environment. Ukraine is well known. It's not like it was 20 years ago. I don't think there's anybody in the agricultural world today that doesn't know that Ukraine is #1 in some products, is #2 and 3 in others. It's growing quickly in organics production for Europe. There's lots of different things that are happening. A lot more will happen, provided, I think, that the business environment keeps going and moving in the right direction. But I'm not convinced. When I was working with the World Bank Group, we did a paper a number of years ago. You know, what was it that created this much change that took place, you know, in 10 or so years ago? And our conclusion was, and I think it's published, I don't think it's a secret, our conclusion was the change came from the activities of the private sector. It was not the government. If we wait for the government to make these changes, to make this move ahead, I don't think we're going to be waiting for a long time. Somehow we have to put some new things into the equation to make things change.
This is a very good point, Gary. I'm very thankful for that. It's not up to the government. And, you know, Ukrainians for a certain period of time were expecting all things to be sorted out by the government. I mean, that was this paternalistic feeling. Thanks to the Revolution of Dignity and many other developments in Ukraine, we now feel that the government is not going to do anything. We have to do it. And private sector is the one where the change is going to come from. And this is actually a powerful force to drive that change. So this is very good. You know, in this kind of panel, it's sort of difficult to have it entertaining because you all agree with each other. You see, that's the problem. Because if you didn't agree, you would fight here and be more sort of like a more vibrant discussion, but you're all on the same page. Anyways, we're running out of time, but I have one marketing question for you all. You can answer it briefly, but I will specify my question. The question is the following: Ukraine is producing lots of agricultural commodities, right? And in a way, we export them as a commodity. So our business is actually growing those crops, selling them out, you know, initial processing, but we don't focus on brands. What I mean, actually, so for instance, when some countries produce coffee, they sell coffee, and then there is an American company, Starbucks, which makes huge lots of money on selling a Starbucks coffee, right? Or we have Kellogg's, who just package in cereals, and they don't produce cereals, they just package it, but the margins there are very high. There is a country called Ceylon or Sri Lanka in South Asia, and they used to sell, and they are the biggest exporters of tea. And for a long time, they would only sell tea as a commodity to British companies and other European companies who would package their tea and sell it under their own brands, like Lipton or any other brand. And in the 80s, there was one man in Ceylon who said, look, I don't want to do it. I want to have my own brand. He came up with this brand called Dilmach, which is very popular in Ukraine because Soviet Union was one of the first markets for him, and he came with a branded product. Everybody in there said, oh, you're crazy, we've never done it, we always exported that as a commodity, why do you want to have your own brand? And he made a revolution on the market of Sri Lanka because all others have followed, because his earnings from that business were huge, because he actually took it away from the Brits. And my question is the following: do you think Ukraine could do something similar? For instance, we're exporting so much sunflower oil, right? Maybe, but it's a commodity. So on local markets, it's repackaged under local brands. Maybe there is an opportunity to package it and actually have a branded Ukrainian sunflower oil and actually do it there. Other products are there. I mean, do you see an opportunity? Maybe there are some examples. This is just to provoke your thoughts on this, and briefly, if you can.
Okay, I tried to be a little briefly, but let's say that what I see is there's potential risk on those lines, trying to brand something. I'll give an example. We don't do GMOs in Ukraine, right?
Officially.
Yeah, and we sell these non-GMO crops to China, right? Because they don't want GMOs. And we branding this as Ukrainian. Is that a good idea? I'm not so sure about it. I think before we really talk about being able to have a brand that we can defend, we have to change the culture in this country. When we produce something, we make sure that it's being produced in a way that can be relied upon, can be trusted upon. And so I'm sorry to say, maybe up until this day, I see there's still lots of games being played. People will think that they can be a little bit more heated, and get around and make something, pull the wool over somebody's eyes. This has to stop. I think only when that stops, when we begin to see a cultural change, and we see it in some businesses. I've seen some organic producers from Poltava Oblast who have done wonderful job exporting to Western Europe, and they have done it based on the fact that you can trust these Ukrainian products and the Ukrainian branding. But until we see that as become part of the culture of this country, I think branding is going to be difficult.
I think the question you ask on the brands is connected to the previous topic on investing in food processing. So if we answer that this is not time now to invest in food processing, there is no ground for your question. But there is a lack of confidence. And probably we may think of using the new Agency for Food Security and Food Quality to have, when it will work normally, which is not the case in my view at the moment, to have a sort of Quality Ukraine, something like that, a sort of national brand that would assess and certify the quality and the good quality, yes, and the fact that you can be confident with the product. But it needs that we are sure that this institution is working really independently. You cannot buy under the table the certificate. And if we are able to do that, yes, there might be a brand, a Ukrainian brand, for honey, for several products which are really native from Ukraine, and it would demonstrate the quality. I remember one of my last discussions with a French oil importer and oil producer and processing in France. He said, twice during the last 5 years, I had big problems with the seeds and the oil coming from Ukraine. We were not those that we expected to import. So there is something to do there, because there is the source of confidence.
I look at the margin. I'll give you an example. We are a major producer of peas and chickpeas in Ukraine, one of the largest. We once looked at the processing of peas. Processing of peas is a relatively simple process. You clean them, you polish them, and then eventually you would package them and you would sell them. What is the margin? Anybody guess? Less than 5%, probably 3.5%, 4%. Now, I could say to you that, well, first of all, I can tell you directly that it's not a business, especially not in Ukraine. However, if we go back to what Jean-Jacques said, we go back to infrastructure, we go back to logistics, we go back to roads, we start with infrastructure, and I'm going way back, making the growing and the go-to-market of peas cheaper, more effective and all, the margins will be greater. There is so much behind why we don't even get to processing. There's so much behind, even just the growing, that we need to work on today. That is the infrastructure. It's just many, many different things that could give additive value to just simply growing and selling of crops. Once we get that done, we can talk about polishing peas and processing corn. We can do all of that because we will be the lowest cost, highest margin country in the world. And it's for Ukraine to do that, it is very easy. I mean, it's very costly, but it can be done. Ukraine is the perfect platform for that. So it's all about the margin. We can get to branded products, but we need to really look back in the value chain on how we can improve the cost effectiveness of that product.
Thank you very much. John Shmorhun?
Yes, I would just add a small comment, which are probably not directly connected, but anyway, once again, look at the figures. There are discussions now in Ukraine to know whether and when the last or the future tranche from the monetary fund will be paid. $1.7 billion. Why is there a discussion about that? Excuse me. I'm fed up with the discussion on still subsidizing somehow Ukraine that way. There are 2 million people that have left Ukraine during last 3-4 years. Most of them are sending back money to the family. Probably around 2,000 euro each. 3 million people, 2,000. $6 billion coming from abroad, increasing the gross production of Ukraine. The money could be used. The money is there. We should simply say, what should we focus on? Is it priority to get some more money from the monetary fund, or to use the money that is available in the amount that is available to finance these things? Excuse me.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so I would like to thank Gary Reusche and Jean-Jacques Herve and John Shmorhun for their insights and thoughts. We really appreciate it. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Of Agriculture and Food panel, and now the final word to close the agro and food security theme. Let me introduce you our keynote speaker, Dmytro Titarenko, who is the founder and CEO of Agroport Ukraine. Dmytro, please come.
Good morning. To follow up this great panel, I would like to demonstrate an example of our Agroport project, how the attitude is changing towards making business in Ukraine, how the attitude towards Ukraine is being changed the international markets. But to start with, I would like to describe our Agroport project. It was initiated in 2014 in Kharkiv region. It was the time when business activities were on the lowest level. In fact, we didn't know how the situation would evolve. We made great stakes, and presently we see the indicators. I would like to ask to launch a video. Agroport invites to Ukrainian regions exhibition of equipment and technologies, workshops for farmers with sector experts, demonstrations, test drives. Lviv, 1921, April, Kherson, 26-28, June, Kharkiv, 13 of October. Join agrarian sector leaders of West east and south of Ukraine in Ukrainian agroports. Agroport 5 years in Ukraine. Presently, Agroport is a set of regions, tens of thousands of visitors every year. It's approximately 300 companies that participate, not only national ones. It's one of indicators how they are willing to cooperate with us. The deeper we delved into the agrarian business in Ukraine, the more we could see problems to cope with using joint efforts and to focus our attention. What we could see is sales. What is interesting to many producers is sales markets. It's not a secret that we are seen as a cheap raw materials market. We have a lot of fraud stories regarding our producers, and now we could see a new line for development for our project. The next video I would like to demonstrate is an example how we can jointly form a transparent market with real good stories about our agro producers. One more video, please.
And together with my team, I'm glad to represent a new project called Agroport XBio. It is a niche marketplace for B2B market, which guarantees direct access for organic buyers all over the world to organic producers.
Основная проблема, на которую направлено решение, это
The main problem is sales. For example, I'm a farmer. I would like to sell my products as expensive as possible.
Buyers with good quality products and lowest price.
А я трейдер, они будут счастливы.
I'm a trader. They will be happy if they work without middleman. And in the domestic market, it's quite doable. In international markets, they have linguistic barrier, and they do not understand where and how they can find producers and how to get their direct contacts. Only every fifth farmer has their own website, but no single one guarantees operational communications. Farmers do not check their emails often.
Find necessary goods among proven organic producers using my own language and receive push notifications about new proposals.
А я буду получать пуши только на свои товары.
And I will get push notifications on my national language. I need just to get registered, to download my certificate, and after that my products will be available for sales. I will get requests only for my products.
I add the products of interest to my favorites, on which I would receive notifications further. Both producer and I will form a reputational story of each other by ratings and reviews upon the deal's completion. We start from Ukraine with more than 300 organic producers, which is only 100th part of the percent of the world market. Starting from 2018, more than 60% have already passed pre-registration, and were represented during Fruit Logistica and Biofach among buyers from 170 countries.
Уже на этом этапе только в основном
At this stage, the main market of buyers is more than 2,000 potential users of Agroport. If Uber worked at that market, it would be our main competitor, because the international sites are not adjusted to the tasks and do not have targeted buyers.
And become the source of the most recent information about products, prices and balances. This solution is exclusively for mobile devices, no matter you have an Android or iOS.
Почему органика? Только тут мы
Why organic? Because only here we can differentiate between middlemen and producers, and the standard model process among operators can be scaled at all markets.
It is a real opportunity for the development of small and medium-sized producers, which support is major priority in all countries.
вже наприкінці
In late May we will launch our project. It's our pleasure that organic production is our main trend. We get support from agrarian producers. More than 60% of operators joined us and expect commencement. We got support from Ukrainian investors who invest in that startup. I would like to invite all of you to visit our next event in Kherson in July 26-28. It will be the first Southern event together with Regional Administration, Agroport South Kherson 2018. Thank you.